Here is part one of the new story, written with the specific cadence and emotional weight of your sample. The Melody of the Silent Lighthouse. Part 1. Two golden retriever mixes, mere bundles of wet fur and shivering bones, huddled together at the base of the spiraling iron stairs. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean roared like a beast denied its prey, crashing against the thick glass of the lighthouse lantern room. But inside, the silence was heavier than the storm. Up in the galley, a man sat in a wheelchair, his hands resting lifelessly on his lap. He was staring at an old grand piano that hadn't been touched in 3 years. He didn't know the dogs were there. Not yet. He didn't know that the tide had washed up something other than driftwood and regret. To understand the miracle, we have to understand the silence. The coastline of Maine, in late November, is a place of gray ghosts. The fog rolls in thick and heavy, swallowing the jagged cliffs and the lonely structures that dare to stand upon them. It was not just quiet. It was a suffocating stillness. Perched on the edge of Blackwood Point stood the lighthouse, its white paint peeling, a sentinel watching over a sea that took more than it gave. Inside lived Julian Thorne, 42 years old, a man built of music, now dismantled by tragedy. He had been a concert pianist, the kind who could make a crowded hall in Vienna hold its breath with a single chord. His hands were insured for millions, but his heart had been priceless. Then came the accident. A drunk driver on a slick highway. His wife, Elena, died instantly. Julian survived, but his spine was crushed, and his hands, though intact, trembled with a neurological tremor that no doctor could fix. He called it his penance. The world called it a tragedy. Now his days passed in the rhythmic flashing of the lighthouse beam. Rotate, flash, darkness. Rotate, flash, darkness. He spoke to no one. The local supply delivery boy, a teenager named Sam, dropped off groceries at the dock once a week. Julian would watch from the window, waiting for the boy to leave before wheeling himself down the ramp to retrieve the boxes. He wanted the world to forget him, just as he tried to forget the music that constantly played in his head. The storm began on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't a normal gale. It was a nor'easter, a swirling vortex of ice and wind that screamed against the stone walls. Julian sat by the window, watching the waves smash against the rocks below. The spray flew 50 feet into the air, freezing before it hit the ground. He tightened the blanket around his legs. The lighthouse groaned under the assault. "Let it blow," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "Let it take it all." He turned his wheelchair away from the window, moving toward the small kitchenette to make tea. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the low rumble of the wind. But then, he heard something else. It was faint. Impossible, really. A scratch, then a whimper. Julian froze. He turned off the stove. The wind howled again, shaking the window frames. He waited, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. There it was again, a desperate, high-pitched yelp coming from the heavy oak door at the base of the tower. Reason told him to ignore it. It was likely a seagull slammed against the door, or the wind playing tricks on a broken mind. But a pull, ancient and undeniable, tugged at his chest. He wheeled himself to the lift he had installed years ago, the gears grinding as he descended to the ground floor. The air grew colder the lower he went. When he reached the entryway, the sound was clearer, frantic scratching, crying. Julian unlocked the heavy deadbolt. It took all his strength to push the iron lever down with his shaking hands. The wind caught the door, ripping it from his grip and slamming it against the stone wall. Snow and freezing rain blasted into the hallway, blinding him for a second. He squinted against the gale, looking down. At first, he saw nothing but drifting snow. Then, a mound of seaweed seemed to move. 2 puppies, soaked to the bone, crawled over the threshold. They were tangled in an old fishing net, dragging it behind them like a heavy chain. One was gold, its fur matted with oil and sand. The other was black as the night, with a patch of white on its chest. They didn't look at him. They were too exhausted. They simply collapsed on the stone floor, their small chests heaving, seeking refuge from the death that waited outside. "What in God's name?" Julian breathed. He looked out into the storm. No boat, no wreckage, visible in the dark. Just the angry, churning sea. He looked back at the puppies. The golden one lifted its head, its eyes wide, terrified and pleading. It let out a sound that broke the last of Julian's defenses. A single, shivering sigh. Julian knew he couldn't leave them. He couldn't bend down to pick them up. Not easily. "Come on," he coaxed, his voice cracking. "Get in, before the sea takes us all." He reversed his wheelchair, giving them space. Instinctively, the black puppy nudged the golden one, and together, they dragged themselves further into the warmth of the hallway. Julian fought the wind to pull the door shut. The slam echoed like a gunshot, sealing the storm away. Now, it was just the man, the silence, and two heartbeats shivering on the floor. He stared at them, water dripping from his own face. "You're safe now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to them or trying to convince himself. Getting the puppies up to the main living quarters was a battle of inches. Julian placed them on his lap, ignoring the soak of freezing seawater seeping into his trousers. The lift hummed its slow, mechanical ascent, carrying the three of them broken man and discarded soul-sup toward the light. In the galley, the warmth of the cast-iron stove hit them like a physical wall. Julian wheeled over to the rug near the hearth. He had to lean forward, gritting his teeth against the phantom pain in his spine, to lower them gently onto the wool. They were shivering violently. The black puppy, the smaller of the two, let out a low whine that sounded like a saw against wood. "Easy," Julian murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." He grabbed a towel from the rack and began to rub them down. His hands, usually plagued by that cursed tremor, found a strange steadiness in the rhythm of the motion. Back and forth, back and forth. As the grime and oil wiped away, their true colors emerged. The golden one was actually a pale cream, its coat thick and soft. The black one had paws dipped in white, like it was wearing formal gloves. They were starving. Julian opened a can of beef stew, his own dinner, and poured it into 2 ceramic bowls. They ate with a ferocity that made his chest ache. They didn't just eat, they devoured, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting the ocean to come back and steal the food away. "Slow down," Julian whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. It was a foreign sensation. The muscles of his face, unused to anything but a frown. Nobody is taking it. When they were full, the collapse was instant. The cream puppy curled into a ball, tucking its nose under its tail. The black one rested its head on the other's flank, closing its eyes. Julian sat in his wheelchair, watching the firelight dance across their sleeping forms. For the first time in 3 years, the lighthouse didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a waiting room. "You need names," he said to the silence. He looked at the cream one, the one with the fighting spirit who had dragged the net. "Major," he decided, for the bright key. He looked at the black one, the quiet shadow. "Minor," for the sad one. Major and minor, 2 chords that made up every song he had ever played. The night deepened. The storm outside raged on, throwing ice against the glass. But Julian didn't retreat to his bedroom. He stayed in the galley, watching them breathe. In, out, in, out. It was a rhythm more perfect than any metronome. Days turned into a week. The storm broke, leaving the sky a bruised purple, and the lighthouse returned to its silent duty. But the silence inside was different now. It was punctuated by the click of claws on floorboards, the squeak of a chew toy Julian had fashioned from an old rope, and the soft sighs of contentment. However, Julian remained distant from the one thing that defined him: the piano. It stood in the corner of the round room, covered in a dusty sheet, like a shrouded corpse. Major and Minor were curious about it. They would sniff the wooden legs. And once, Major had barked at his own reflection in the polished brass pedals. Julian always called them away. "No," he would say sharply. "Not there." He couldn't bear to look at it. The instrument was a reminder of what his hands could no longer do. The tremors were still there, shaking his coffee cup, making buttoning his shirt a 10-minute ordeal. But one evening, just as the sun was setting and painting the ocean in strips of gold and fire, something changed. Julian was reading by the window. He hadn't noticed that the door to the music corner was slightly ajar. A sound shattered the quiet. Plink. A single, discordant note. Julian spun his wheelchair around. Minor had climbed onto the piano bench. The puppy was standing on its hind legs, front paws resting tentatively on the keys. Plink, plunk. 2 more notes. Random, clumsy, but unmistakable. "Get down," Julian's voice was a whip crack. Minor flinched, ears flattening, and scrambled off the bench, hiding behind the sofa. Major barked defensively, standing between Julian and his brother. Julian froze. His heart was pounding in his throat. He wheeled himself closer to the instrument. The sheet had slipped off one side, revealing the ivory keys, yellowed slightly with age. He stared at them. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a hollow H. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the dogs, his voice trembling. "It's just, that's not for us anymore." He reached out, his hand hovering over the keys. His fingers shook violently. He couldn't do it. He couldn't play a simple scale without his nerves misfiring. He pulled his hand back, defeated. But as he turned to leave, he felt a weight on his footrest. Major had walked over. The dog didn't cower. He rested his chin on Julian's knee, looking up with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 years of patience. Then, Minor crept out. He moved slowly, cautiously, until he was under the piano. He lay down right there, beneath the pedals, resting his head on the wooden lyre. He wasn't afraid of the machine. He was guarding it. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. "You want music?" he asked softly. Major wagged his tail once. Thump. "I can't give you music," Julian said, tears pricking his eyes. "The music is gone." But that night, Julian dreamed. He didn't dream of the crash, or the hospital, or the funeral. He dreamed of a melody. It was simple, haunting, and it sounded like the ocean. And in the dream, he wasn't playing it alone. He woke up with a start, sweat cooling on his forehead. The lighthouse beam swept past the window. Flash. Darkness. Down on the rug, the dogs were awake. They were sitting up, staring at him, waiting. And Julian realized, with a terrifying clarity, that they weren't just waiting for breakfast. They were waiting for him to begin. The cover of the piano slid to the floor with a sound like a heavy sigh. Dust motes danced in the shaft of morning light that cut through the lantern room, swirling around Julian's wheelchair. The Steinway sat exposed, its black lacquer dull from neglect, its ivory keys grinning like an old friend waiting for a conversation to resume. Julian sat there for a long time. His hands rested on his knees, clenched into fists to hide the shaking. Major sat to his left, tall and statuesque. Minor lay under the bench, his chin resting on the pedal lyre, eyes fixed on Julian's feet. "This is a mistake," Julian muttered. He reached out. His right hand hovered over middle C. The tremor was violent. His fingers twitched, like they were fighting an invisible current. He tried to press a single key, but his index finger slipped, mashing two notes together in a discordant clash. Clang. The sound was ugly, harsh. Julian recoiled as if burned. He slammed his hand back onto the armrest of his chair. "I can't," he shouted, the anger exploding from his chest. "I can't do it." The shout echoed off the curved stone walls. Minor scrambled out from under the piano, tail tucked. Major whined, stepping back. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of failure. Julian covered his face with his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered into his palms. "I'm just broken." He felt a wet nose nudge his elbow. He didn't look up. The nudge came again, harder this time. Julian lowered his hands. Major was there, staring at him. The dog didn't look frightened anymore. He looked insistent. He pushed his large, blocky head under Julian's trembling hand, forcing Julian to stroke his ears. The fur was warm, solid. Julian focused on that warmth. He focused on the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing against his leg. In, out, slowly. The frantic, erratic beating of his own heart began to match the dog's. The tremors in his hand didn't stop, but they softened. They became a vibration rather than an earthquake. "You're not going to let me quit, are you?" Julian asked softly. Major licked his wrist. Julian took a deep breath. He didn't try to be the concert pianist he once was. He didn't try to play Rachmaninoff or Liszt. He didn't try to be fast. He just tried to be true. He lifted his hand again. This time, he didn't hover. He let the weight of his arm guide him. He pressed down. A C major chord. Rich, deep, resonant. The sound filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards, through the wheelchair, through the dogs. Minor's ears perked up. He trotted back and sat right beside the bench, tilting his head. Julian held the cord until it faded into nothing. Then, he moved his left hand. Hum. An A minor. Major let out a soft sigh and laid his head back on Julian's lap. And then, it happened. The melody from the dream returned. It wasn't complex. It was slow, mournful, but incredibly beautiful. Julian played with the spaces between the notes. He let the silence be part of the music. His hand still shook, but he used the tremor to create a vibrato, a wavering intensity that made the piano sound like it was weeping. For the first time in 3 years, music flowed from the lighthouse. It drifted up into the lantern room, swirling with the dust. It slipped through the cracks in the window frames and out into the crisp, cold air of the Atlantic morning. Julian closed his eyes. Tears streamed down his face, getting caught in his beard, but he didn't stop playing. He played for his wife. He played for his legs. He played for the 2 souls sleeping at his feet who had saved him from the storm. Outside, at the base of the lighthouse, a bicycle skidded to a halt on the gravel path. Sam, the delivery boy, stood straddling his bike, a box of groceries strapped to the back. He was wearing bulky headphones, but he pulled them down around his neck. He stared up at the tower, his mouth slightly open. The wind usually carried the sound of crashing waves or seagulls, but today, the wind carried something else. It was a song. It was the saddest, most beautiful thing Sam had ever heard. He stood there for 10 minutes, listening to the ghost of Blackwood Point come back to life. He didn't know about the dogs inside. He didn't know about the struggle. He only knew that the lighthouse wasn't silent anymore. Inside, Julian played the final note. It hung in the air, suspended, before fading into the sound of the ocean. He slumped back in his chair, exhausted, sweat drenching his shirt. Major looked up, tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm on the floor. "Not bad," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not bad for a start." He looked at his hands. They were still shaking, but they were no longer empty. Winter settled over Blackwood Point with a grip of iron. The ocean turned a bruised shade of slate gray, and the cliffs were encased in sheets of salt spray ice. But the lighthouse was no longer a tomb. It was a beacon, not just of light, but of sound. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Julian would wheel himself to the piano. Major would take his place by the bass keys, and Minor would curl up under the pedals. Julian played. He didn't play the intricate, lightning-fast sonatas of his past. His hands wouldn't allow it. Instead, he played slow, aching ballads. He improvised, letting the tremors in his fingers add a weeping quality to the notes. He thought he was playing for the ocean. He didn't know he was playing for an audience. It started with Sam, the delivery boy. Then it was the old fisherman, Elias, who anchored his boat just offshore to listen. Then couples from the town began parking their cars at the edge of the cliff road, rolling down their windows despite the freezing cold, just to catch the faint melody drifting on the wind. They called it the ghost of the point. Julian knew none of this. He was still locked in his tower, safe in his solitude. 2 weeks before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the coast. The road to the lighthouse was buried under 3 feet of white powder. Julian sat by the fire, knitting a clumsy knot into a rope toy for Minor. The dogs were restless. Major kept pacing to the heavy oak door, sniffing the draft that seeped underneath. "What is it, boy?" Julian asked, looking up. Major let out a sharp bark. Then another. He scratched at the wood. Julian frowned. "There's nothing out there but snow, Major. Settle down." But the dog wouldn't settle. He ran to Julian, nudged his hand, then ran back to the door. Minor joined in, whining high and thin. Julian sighed, setting his knitting aside. All right. Probably a squirrel trying to get in." He wheeled himself to the lift and descended. As the lift reached the ground floor, the cold was biting. Major rushed the door, barking furiously now. Julian unlocked the deadbolt and pushed. The door stuck against a snowdrift, but he shoved harder, cracking it open a few inches. He expected to see white emptiness. Instead, he saw a splash of neon orange. A parka, huddled against the stone wall, half buried in the snow, was a figure. It was Sam. The boy was curled into a tight ball, his bicycle lying on its side a few feet away, its chain snapped and useless. He wasn't moving. "Hey," Julian shouted. the wind tearing the word from his mouth. The figure didn't stir. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Julian's chest. He couldn't go out there. His wheelchair would sink instantly. "Major," Julian yelled, pointing at the gap in the door. "Go." He didn't need to say it twice. The cream-colored dog squeezed through the crack, diving into the snow like a seal into water. Major reached the boy in seconds. He began to lick Sam's face, barking loudly, his tail acting like a frantic metronome against the snow. Sam groaned. He moved a hand to push the dog away, his movements sluggish. "Hypothermia." "Get up," Julian roared, straining against the doorframe. "You have to get up, son." Sam blinked, dazed. He looked at the dog, then at the open door where Julian sat. Major grabbed the sleeve of Sam's coat in his teeth and pulled. He growled, digging his paws into the ice, tugging with all the strength of his 80 pounds. "Help him," Julian shouted to Minor, who was squeezing through the gap now. The smaller black dog joined his brother, nudging Sam's legs, whining urgently, slowly, painfully. Sam pushed himself up. He stumbled, falling once, but Major was there, offering a sturdy shoulder to lean on. Guided by the two dogs, the boy staggered toward the light of the doorway. When he fell across the threshold, Julian grabbed the back of his jacket and hauled him inside, slamming the door against the wind. The silence of the tower returned, but this time it was broken by harsh, rattling breaths. Julian worked with a speed he hadn't possessed in years. He got Sam onto the lift floor, piling blankets on him that he kept in the emergency locker. Up in the galley, he cranked the heat. He heated soup. He rubbed life back into the boy's frozen hands. Major and Minor didn't leave Sam's side. They lay on top of his legs, acting as living hot water bottles, their body heat seeping into him. An hour later, Sam sat up, shivering, clutching a mug of tea. He looked around the room, the warm fire, the grand piano, the man in the wheelchair, and the two dogs who were watching him with intense, golden eyes. I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne," Sam stammered, his teeth chattering. "My chain broke. I tried to walk back, but the wind, it was too strong. I just wanted to rest for a minute." "A minute out there is forever, Sam," Julian said gruffly, though his eyes were kind. "You almost died on my doorstep." Sam looked down at Major, who was resting his chin on the boy's knee. "He woke me up. I think I was falling asleep." "He did," Julian nodded. "They both did." Sam ran a hand through Major's thick fur. "I didn't know you had dogs. I thought, everyone says you live alone." "I did," Julian said, looking at the fire. "Until the sea brought them." Sam took a sip of tea, then looked at the piano. He hesitated. "Was it you?" he asked softly. "The music?" Julian stiffened. "You heard it? Everyone hears it," Sam said, his eyes widening. "People come from town to listen. We stand on the road. It makes the cold feel less cold, sir." Julian stared at him. "People listen?" "Yes." Sam smiled weakly. "They say it sounds like hope." Julian looked at his trembling hands, then at the dogs. Major looked back, tail wagging slowly, as if to say, "See? We told you." For 3 years, Julian had thought he was screaming into the void. He hadn't realized the void was listening. "Stay here tonight, Sam," Julian said quietly. "The storm isn't done." And clearly, he gestured to the dogs who had pinned the boy to the sofa. "You're not going anywhere." That night, Julian didn't play for the ghosts. He wheeled himself to the piano. Sam watched from the sofa, buried in blankets and dogs. "This one," Julian said, his voice steady, "is for the rescuers." He began to play. It was a warmer melody this time, less minor key, more light. It sounded like a fireplace in winter. It sounded like a heartbeat returning. And for the first time, inside the lighthouse, there was applause. The storm exhaled its last breath by morning, leaving the world scoured clean and blindingly white. Sam left just after dawn. He fixed his bicycle chain with a pair of pliers from Julian's toolbox, his breath puffing clouds into the frigid air. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Sam said, standing at the door. He looked down at the dogs. "And thank you, boys." Major licked Sam's hand one last time, a solemn goodbye. "Sam," Julian called out, stopping the boy. Don't make a big deal out of this. The music. It's just passing time." Sam smiled, a knowing, secret smile. "Yes, sir." just passing time. But secrets in a small town are like water in a sieve. The days leading up to Christmas Eve were quiet, but the atmosphere in the lighthouse had shifted. The air felt charged. Julian found himself practicing more. He wasn't just improvising anymore. He was revisiting the old scores stored in the bench, Chopin's Nocturnes, Beethoven's Pathétique. His hands still shook. He still hit wrong notes. But when he didn't slam the lid shut. He simply took a breath, felt the warm weight of Major's head on his foot, and started again. He was learning to forgive himself. Christmas Eve arrived with a sky so clear. The stars looked like diamonds, scattered on black velvet. Julian had planned a quiet evening, a tin of smoked oysters, a glass of wine, and extra treats for the dogs. But at 7 o'clock, Minor began to bark. It wasn't his usual, hungry bark. It was an alert. He ran to the window, stood on his hind legs, and pawed at the glass. What is it now? Julian sighed, wheeling himself over. He looked down at the winding cliff road that led to the point. His breath caught in his throat. Lights, dozens of them. A river of golden headlights was snake-winding its way toward the lighthouse. Cars, trucks, vans. They moved slowly, respectfully, parking on the grassy verge at the edge of the property line. Julian watched in horror. No, he whispered. No, no. The engines cut off. Doors opened. People stepped out into the freezing night. They didn't approach the door. They didn't knock. They simply stood by their cars, wrapped in scarves and coats, facing the tower. They were waiting. They want a concert, Julian said, his voice trembling. They want the man I used to be. He backed his wheelchair away from the window. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. He looked at his hands. They were shaking violently now, the tremors fueled by fear. I can't, he choked out. I'm broken. They'll hear the mistakes. They'll hear the shakes. He turned to leave the room, to retreat to the safety of his bedroom in the dark. But his path was blocked. Major stood in the doorway. He didn't move. He stood broadside, a wall of cream fur and muscle. Move, Major, Julian snapped. Major didn't budge. He let out a low woof. Minor trotted over to the piano. He jumped onto the bench, something he knew he wasn't allowed to do, and sat there, looking at Julian. He hit a key with his paw. Plink. The sound hung in the air. Julian looked at Major, then at Minor. The dogs weren't asking him to be perfect. They were asking him to be brave. You two are relentless, Julian whispered, tears stinging his eyes. He looked back at the window. Down below, the crowd stood in silence. They hadn't come for perfection. They had come for connection. They had come to be less alone on a holy night. Julian took a deep, shuddering breath. He wheeled himself to the grand piano. Okay, he murmured. Okay. He didn't just open the lid. He reached for the lever on the wall that controlled the lantern room's ventilation windows. With a groan of rusted gears, the heavy glass panes tilted open. The cold ocean air rushed in, smelling of salt and snow. Now, there was no barrier. Major walked over and sat by the pedals. Minor curled up on the rug. Julian placed his hands on the keys. The cold air bit at his fingers. But strangely, the chill seemed to steady them. He closed his eyes. He didn't choose a classical piece. He chose something simpler, something older. Silent Night. He pressed the first chord. It rang out, clear and true, amplified by the stone acoustics of the tower, drifting out through the open windows, down the cliffs, and washing over the people standing in the dark. Music didn't just leave the tower. It escaped. The notes of Silent Night floated down through the freezing air, fragile and crystalline, mixing with the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the cliffs. Julian played slowly. He had to. If he rushed, his fingers would tangle. So he turned the tempo into a heartbeat thump-thump, pause, thump-thump, pause, to the people standing below, wrapped in their scarves and parkas. It didn't sound like a man struggling with a disability. It sounded like a man having a conversation with God. Inside the lantern room, the cold was biting. Julian's breath plumed in white clouds before his face. His knuckles were white, straining to keep the tremor controlled. He hit a wrong note, a sharp B, instead of a soft A. He flinched, expecting the spell to break. But Major, sitting at his feet, simply licked Julian's ankle. A warm, wet reminder. Keep going. It doesn't matter. Julian took a breath and resolved the chord. He turned the mistake into a bridge, finding a way back to the melody. He realized then that he had spent 3 years mourning the perfection he had lost, never realizing the beauty of the struggle that remained. He segued from Silent Night into Auld Lang Syne. It was a song of old friends, of times gone by, a song of goodbyes. As he played, he thought of Elena. For the first time, her memory didn't bring the crushing weight of the car crash. It brought the memory of her laugh. He imagined her standing by the window, humming along. Tears froze on his cheeks. He played the final chord. He let it ring out, holding the sustain pedal down until the vibration died away completely, leaving only the sound of the wind. Julian took his hands off the keys. He gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his chest heaving. He waited for the sound of engines starting. He waited for them to leave. Instead, a different light filled the room. Julian wheeled himself to the window and looked down. Below, in the darkness, the people hadn't clapped. The wind would have swallowed the sound anyway. Instead, they had raised their lights. Hundreds of flashlights, cell phone screens, and lanterns were held up in the air. A sea of tiny stars mirroring the sky above, swaying gently in the dark. A silent ovation. "Look at that, boys," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Look at that." Major put his paws up on the windowsill, gazing down at the lights. Minor joined him, tail wagging slowly. For a man who had lived in the dark for so long, the light was almost blinding. Julian stayed there until the last car had turned around and driven away, leaving the point to its solitude once more. But the isolation was gone. The connection had been made. He closed the heavy windows, sealing the warmth back in. "Come on," he said to the dogs. "Let's go downstairs. It's Christmas." He wheeled himself to the lift. As they descended, Julian looked at his hands. They were still his. They were damaged, yes. Shaking, yes. But they were no longer useless. They had brought warmth to a cold night. They had saved 2 dogs. And in return, 2 dogs had saved the music. Spring arrived at Blackwood Point not with a roar, but with a whisper. The ice sheets on the cliffs cracked and fell into the sea, replaced by the green fuzz of moss and the return of the puffins nesting in the rocks. The lighthouse looked different now. The peeling paint had been scraped away and refreshed with a coat of brilliant white. A job done by Sam and a few volunteers from town. But the biggest change wasn't on the outside. On a Tuesday afternoon in May, the heavy oak door stood wide open. Sunlight poured into the hallway, warming the stone that had been cold for so long. Inside, the sound of a piano filled the air, but it wasn't Julian playing. It was a young girl named Lily. She was 10 years old, born with only 3 fingers on her left hand. She sat at the Steinway, her face scrudged in concentration. Julian sat in his wheelchair beside her, tapping a rhythm on his knee. "Don't worry about reaching the octave, Lily," he said gently. "If you can't reach it, change it. Make the music fit you. Don't try to fit the music." Lily hit a chord. It was unusual, slightly dissonant, but lovely. "Like that?" she asked. "Exactly like that." Julian smiled. Under the piano, Minor let out a contented snore. He was fast asleep, his paw twitching in a dream. Major sat by Lily's feet, acting as a silent, furry metronome, his tail thumping softly against the floorboards. The lighthouse had become a sanctuary. It started small. Sam had asked if Julian could teach his little sister. Then came the girl from the bakery who was too shy to play in public. Then came the veteran with the tremor in his hands. Much like Julian's, they didn't come to learn how to be concert pianists. They came to learn how to play through the cracks in their lives. They came to the Lighthouse of Broken Chords, as the locals affectionately called it. Later that evening, after the last student had gone, Julian wheeled himself out onto the gallery deck that encircled the lantern room. The air smelled of brine and blooming wildflowers. Major and Minor trotted out with him. They were older now, a little slower, but their eyes were just as bright. Julian looked out at the horizon, where the purple sky met the dark water. The light above them began its nightly rotation. Flash, darkness, flash. For years Julian had thought his job was to warn people away, to keep them off the rocks, to say, "Stay back. It's dangerous here." He looked down at his trembling hands resting on the armrests. Then he looked at the two dogs who had dragged themselves and him out of the storm. He realized now that a lighthouse does two things. Yes, it warns ships of the danger, but it also tells the lost where the land is. It says, "Here is safety. Here is home." Julian reached down. Major pressed his head into Julian's palm. Minor leaned against the wheel of the chair. "We did good, boys," Julian whispered to the wind. "We did good." The ocean roared below, eternal and vast. But it was no longer the loudest thing on the point. The loudest thing was the silence of a heart that was finally, truly full. And if you listened closely, caught on the breeze between the crash of the waves, you could still hear it. A melody. Imperfect, shaking, and absolutely perfect.